The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you to everyone who's joined us already. We've got another minute to go before we get started, but we'll be starting very soon. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first of our 4 webinar series on the implementation of trauma-informed care. This is Jean Brueggemann. I'm the Executive Director of the Freedom Network USA, and we're bringing you this series in partnership with OVCTTTAC at the Office for Victims of Crime, and we're really excited for this webinar series. It was fully registered. We did max out our registration, so we know there's a lot of excitement and interest in the topic and the issue, and we hope you'll really enjoy this webinar series. Just to start with, we have some information we wanted to share with you. As I mentioned, this series is brought to you by OVC and OVCTTAC. The Office for Victims of Crime was established in 1984 by the Victims of Crime Act to oversee the Crime Victims Fund, which brings funding in through fees and penalties assessed to perpetrators of federal crimes, and then puts that money back out for victim services through state victim assistance and victim compensation programs. They also provide training by request and online resources, customized training and technical assistance like this webinar series, and professional development scholarships for individuals and teams. You can find out more information about OVC and OVCTTAC by following these links on your screen. In order to have access to this information, after the webinar or at any time, you'll have to look and see on the side of your screen where you have the access to resources. You'll see that there are handouts available. One of the handouts for this webinar series is a copy of this presentation. So you can get access to these links and resources and all of the information provided to you during the webinar series by downloading the copy of the presentation. The Freedom Network is a membership organization here in the United States. We were established in 2001, soon after the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, when several providers around the United States started collaborating with the federal government in the prosecution and providing services to the victims during the prosecution of several trafficking cases. And it was established in order to provide the support and collaboration to those providers. We currently have 38 members, organizations and individuals, who are providing services and or advocacy for survivors of human trafficking here in the United States. All of our members are committed to using a human rights-based approach, which prioritizes the experience and choices of trafficked individuals in both service provision, advocacy, mentorship, and the development of an anti-trafficking field. We provide voluntary, non-judgmental assistance that is culturally competent and language appropriate. We also are committed to providing opportunities and support for the development of survivor leadership. Some of the activities that the Freedom Network is engaged in include training and technical assistance. We host an annual conference, which will be in the DC area in 2017, mentoring and support for our member organizations and individuals, and advocacy and leadership in the anti-trafficking movement. So that's a little bit about us and about OVC and OVCTTAC, but I also wanted to tell you a little bit about this webinar series. This is the first of a 4 series that all builds on each other. So these 4 webinars were designed as a series to keep building your knowledge over time, not to be experienced individually. And we developed the series with 2 components. The first being the webinar, which is what you've joined us for today. This 60 minutes will be focused on the presentation of information. There's a lot of information that we've got to give you. In each of the webinars, there will be handouts with some really practical information and resources. And we will be recording each of the webinars as they are presented. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we have maxed out our registration. We have registered 200 attendees for the webinar series and had to close registration. So we do encourage everyone who registered to please join us for each and every webinar, because we have already had to turn away around 150 other individuals who wanted to join the series, but unfortunately we've reached our capacity. If for some reason you cannot join the live webinar during the presentation, we will be sending out a link after the conclusion of each webinar to those who are registered, so that you can watch the recorded webinar before the live chat that happens 2 weeks later, so that you can sort of get caught up in the series and continue on. If you or any of your colleagues who registered for the series are unable to join the rest of the series, or find that it wasn't quite what you expected it to be, or for whatever reason, we do encourage you to unregister for the series so that we can open up your spot for someone else. But please do continue on with the full series if as we're hoping, this will be something that is interesting and helpful to you, to make sure that you keep up, so that as each webinar will assume that everyone has learned the information that came before, and the presenters will assume that information is already clear and understood by you, and build on that in their next webinar. So the other half of the series are the live chat sessions. Because there's so much information that we want to share, the webinar is, as I said, devoted to presentation of information. You can certainly submit questions using the chat box, and those questions will be available to the presenters, and we will hold on to those. But we won't really be able to address them during the short 60 minutes of the webinar. Instead, we are going to hold 2 weeks after each webinar a live chat session, which will be entirely focused on questions and answers. You can give us those questions ahead of time, submit those ahead of time, either through the chat box during the webinar, or at the end of the webinar we'll give you an email address through which you can submit questions in advance. That will ensure that the presenter will be able to prepare an appropriate response and a comprehensive response to your question. You can also then submit a question during the live chat, and we'll work with the presenters and answer as many of those questions as we can. But that is your opportunity to first sit through the webinar, learn the information, maybe take it back to your team, ask some questions, think through some of the information, and then submit some questions to our panel, our group of experts, to really get that dedicated answer, that specific information that you need to make your program a success. So that's the way that the webinar series is going to be run. And now I'm going to turn it over to our expert of the day for today's topic. Introducing you to trauma-informed care is Amy Fleischauer.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank Freedom Network and OVC for including me on as at least just an expert for the day. I like that introduction. I just wanted to give people an idea of the types of services that we provide here in the Survivor Support Services Department at the International Institute of Buffalo. We're part of a larger organization. Our primary purpose as an organization, or our largest department, is really refugee resettlement and employment. But we also have a Survivor Support Services program that serves all survivors of human trafficking, male, female, U.S. citizen immigrants, trafficked into any type of work. And also we have a specialized domestic violence services program for non-citizen survivors of domestic violence. That is our niche in our collaborative DV community here in the Western New York area. Just to give you an idea of some of the statistics for human trafficking in 2015, you can see up on the screen the diversity of clients and cases that we dealt with, and that we were able to partner with those survivors, and also with our domestic violence survivors. And what really sticks out to me, and I'm astounded by this each time, is that of the 145 clients we served in 2015 in our DV program, they came from 43 different countries of origin. So again, really specializing in, especially in the non-citizen immigrant piece. Today, for the next, less than an hour now, we really want to help participants understand some concrete, practical implications of trauma-informed care, and also understand the impact that trauma can have on human trafficking survivors, but really this to all survivors that we work with, really looking at a programmatic view. And again, really stressing practical strategies. I'm going to walk everyone through our evaluation, our self-evaluation at the Institute, and some things that we actually changed in a very practical way, not only through the handouts, but also by giving some tips that you can perhaps use and jot down for very little money. That's the other piece that I think is really important, that a lot of things that we changed here at the Institute really did not cost us a lot of money. It's just to have us look at our services in a different way. Starting with some general definitions, I don't want to read to you, so if you just want to read through these definitions on your screen. Really what the point that I want to make with this is that our program here at the International Institute does not provide trauma treatment. And I think that that's really important. I think a lot of people who are thinking about trauma somehow are thinking about therapy, or experts in mental health counseling, or even psychiatrists and medication. And certainly those professionals deal with trauma, but in a different way. It's really important, so for any program who's working with survivors of trauma, that they understand how trauma may impact survivors who walk through their door and their approach to services, which we'll be talking a little bit more about later, and really make an effort to have trauma awareness and become trauma informed, so that those services can fit clients' needs better, and also that we have a better understanding of clients' perceptions in providing safety, choice, and control. So one of the things that's important is that that we have a universal assumption of trauma with any survivor that's interested in services. They might be coming to us because of a recent or immediate trauma. So it might be the latest, something that's happened to them recently. So if you're a rape crisis counselor, it might be a recent sexual assault if you're meeting somebody in the hospital, for example. But it's also, I think, important to recognize survivors of trauma have multiple or unresolved traumas called complex trauma or polyvictimization. And the evidence of which trauma is most present or how many traumas somebody may experience or which one of those have been resolved when or not is something that you really can't assess within a first or even, frankly, often the first 5 meetings with a client. So having policies and procedures that really espouse trauma-informed care and that are trauma-informed, those are going to ensure that your organization and your interactions with clients are less likely to re-traumatize the survivors that are coming to you for services and support. Why does learning about trauma matter? My practical, I think this is really important from a practical standpoint, and when I'm talking to law enforcement or attorneys or maybe other disciplines that aren't doing direct victim service work, I really like to focus on these practicalities. I often talk about the co-facilitators of our task force here in Western New York, and the very first case that we walked through together was about 9 years ago. It involved a simultaneous raid of many different massage parlors in various towns and villages in suburbs of Western New York. There was a ton of money, a ton of collaboration, a ton of that was put into these raids and operations. And every law enforcement and NGO entity followed their current policies and procedures at the time to a T, and that operation was almost wholly unsuccessful. And that's something actually every one on our task force would admit now. So we learned from that experience that we needed to do things differently, that our policies needed to change. And when I look back on the changes that we've made, what I identify more than anything is that we have all become more trauma-informed. And now the collaborations that we have around cases, which, by the way, rarely now involve raids as a result of becoming more trauma-informed, really come back to these principles of being trauma-informed, which is something that I didn't learn concretely for many more years after that initial experience. But what we know is that when we are trauma-informed, it increases safety for survivors because it triggers survivors much less. It minimizes re-traumatization, which therefore increases safety for staff or other partners. Clients that become triggered can often, their behaviors escalate, which can be dangerous in some ways. So it increases the safety for us. It also increases both the effectiveness and the efficiency of our services. Again, when clients are triggered, when they're re-traumatized, they can't concentrate or have much more difficulty or challenges concentrating on what's at hand or being engaged in services as they're being presented. So I think that learning about trauma and becoming trauma-informed is actually very practical in nature. It's also important to understand that individuals respond to trauma differently. Each individual has different resiliencies and different vulnerabilities, which can make, there might be 5, 10, 20 people who are in the same location at, for instance, a fire. Maybe they're living in an apartment building that burns down, or are part of a mass casualty event, or have experienced trafficking from the same trafficker. And each individual may react or be impacted by trauma differently and to a different degree. Often those differences come back to what their individual resiliencies are, which are listed here. They may be different for each person, and also what their vulnerabilities are, which we know for survivors who have polyvictimization or have experienced multiple traumas, often these can be, often they have many of these vulnerabilities. Because the other thing that we know is that when someone experiences or goes through a trauma, that makes them often more vulnerable to experiencing further trauma. So there's a lot of literature out there around how many guiding principles of trauma-informed care there are. I've seen some research or articles that have narrowed these down to 3, and then I've seen some research and articles that have 14 guiding principles. So I really tried to incorporate each kind of the best of the best out there, and I'll go through each of these throughout today's presentation. But the guiding most would agree that the guiding principles come down to trauma awareness, safety, choice and empowerment, being strength-based, collaboration, which I think for today's presentation and in our own agencies can boil down to our collaboration within our own agency and also with community partners. And also cultural competency, which I actually don't think necessarily should be its own principle, and I'm not going to be talking about it in its own principle, but rather talking about cultural competency and awareness within each of the first 5 that I've mentioned. So I'm just going to start with a poll and just ask people to identify where their daily work. So who do we have on the call today? What is your role within your organization? And I'll leave the poll open just for another 20 seconds or so. Okay, this is great. I'm about to close the poll, but what I'm seeing is that there really is a diversity in those who are on the call today, with the fairly large majority working with survivors of trauma consistently, some managers and some in higher administration. And the reason that I asked that question is that it's very important that we're thinking about trauma-informed care at every level of our work and within our organization. So IIB stands for the International Institute of Buffalo. We have done, we have done a self-evaluation of our program and of our organization. We've done it about every 2 to 2.5 years now for the past 6 years or so, since I became certified in trauma counseling through the University of Buffalo, which, by the way, has an excellent online program if anybody wants to look into that. So these are the steps that we walk through when, as I said, we are going through a self-evaluation. The first thing is that we educated our entire department on trauma and trauma-informed care. The second step is that we identified what do we know works with this population. So we have a brainstorming session around that, which I'll go over. Then we think about where is there a disconnect between what we know works and what we actually do. And that's where we see a possibility of re-traumatization for the survivors that we work with. Then we talk about how can we fix it. So is this something, now that I've looked, now that our staff were walking through this, is this something that I can change and fix individually in my own advocacy and case management and work with survivors? Is this something, how can we fix this on a programmatic level? And then the last step, what policies or procedures may need to change within our program, or that I, as the director of the program, may need to advocate for at an organizational level to change. So these, again, trying to be practical and simple, these are the 5 steps that I'm going to walk through with you today using those, using the principles that I outlined of trauma-informed care. So just to give you an idea of the brainstorming of what we know, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these examples, but it just might give you a template for what you might brainstorm with your own program. We have an attitude of yes in everything that we do here. And what I mean is that we want to create an environment where both survivors and staff, and I mean every staff member there is, from our janitorial staff to our receptionist to our accountant to our case manager to a program manager, that everyone feels as though they can make suggestions and that there is an attitude of yes within our organization. Notice that it's not an attitude of course, but it is an attitude of yes. And we think that that really adds to the dignity that we hope we're espousing in everyone who walks through our doors, calls our organization, or is employed by our organization. The other part of that is that I recently did this presentation for a grant for an organization that was providing a lot of grants to the people in the room. So it was like a funder. And a lot of questions that I received were about, well, how did you make that work within the guidelines of your grant? And how did you get approval for that client to be served? And how did you, it was all about the mandates and limitations of the grant. And while it's so important for us, certainly as administrators, to be aware of what's allowable or unallowable, an attitude of yes really is a broader thought process and attitude, and that what we know is that it's our job as an organization to make sure that whoever is seeking services from us, that we can worry about where they fit in later, that when they walk through the door, that our immediate concern is not where they fit in, but that they fit in, and if they eventually, or we determine that they can't receive or that it's not appropriate to receive services from us, that we are ready to give a warm handoff to an organization that does provide those services. Just a couple of other what we knows on this list. People in pain need kind treatment is something we talk a lot about in our program. That may seem very obvious, but what we know, and this goes down to compliance survivors are easier to work with, is that we like the way that some clients express pain better than others. So while many of us, we know that it's easier perhaps to work, some of us think it's easier to work with somebody who is crying or has a sense of hopelessness or is asking a ton of questions, that might be easier than somebody who's expressing their pain in anger or in blaming us for everything that has happened that's wronged them in the system, for instance. But really, we need to be careful to understand that they're expressing at the core of or how they're expressing that pain is not nearly as important as the fact that they are expressing pain and they need kindness and assistance. People change slowly. Ambivalence is good, but it also, both ambivalence and choice can also be really inconvenient, and that is very important to remember and acknowledge as well. And the core of resistance is meaningful, and this is something we also talk a lot about, that when a client chooses to not engage in our services, often I've heard that, oh, they're just not, they haven't hit rock bottom yet, or, oh, they're just not ready. And while maybe that could be true, I think that there's also an element to victim blaming in that. When a client is chooses not to engage in our services, another possibility could be that we haven't made our services clear or attractive to them, or we haven't done enough work to build books. And it's really important, I think, to be thinking of that and to keep that in mind. I'm remembering a situation once where a domestic violence survivor came to us for assistance. We sat down and explained her rights. We provided some education on what domestic violence is. We talked to her about what her options for safety might be, both in safety planning and through the police or court system. And she was fully engaged in services for about 6 weeks and then just kind of dropped off the face of the earth. We didn't know what had happened. And then she came back about 2 months later, and we repeated the same thing. And this kind of went on for about 1.5 years, where she would go back and forth about engaging in services, but then dropping out of services. Until once the advocate asked, you know, I've noticed, she was very straightforward and said, I've noticed this pattern, and I'm just wondering, you know, if there's anything we can be doing to help you stay engaged in services, or can you tell us more about that? And because we asked the question directly, because we didn't assume the answer, because we weren't blaming the client, very matter-of-factly said, I get very nervous whenever you talk about child protective services, because everyone in my community knows that when you call CPS and when CPS is involved, they inject a serum into children that makes them forget their parents. Well, that was astonishing to us. That's something that we never could have asked about on an intake. It's something that we had never heard before. So it isn't anything that we could have asked outright. And I think because traffickers and abusers and cultural differences, because there's so many manipulations and lies that are told in order to discourage survivors from reaching out and getting help and to maintain control over them, that really our job is rapport building. And because we were able to do that, the client was eventually felt comfortable sharing that core of resistance to services with us so that we could provide some education around that. I'm going to launch another poll. And this question is around whether or not your organization has dedicated time or resources to becoming trained in trauma-informed care. So just a couple more seconds. All right, so overall, it looks like about 50% have said yes, and then about 25% say no or unsure. So that's great. I think that that gives everyone on the call a little bit of an idea of the people on the call and their dedication really organization-wide. The reason I ask that is because in order for a client to, or in order for an organization to truly be trauma-informed, it really needs to be an organization-wide commitment. And so part of that commitment is really ensuring that trauma awareness is understood by everyone that works at the organization. And really understanding that a survivor's trauma affects their approach to services, as I've said before. So one of the things in our evaluation process was to ensure that I needed to make sure as the program director that everyone on my team received education on trauma and trauma-informed care. But it also was to, part of my role in what we brainstormed about how to fix things was to ensure that everyone on staff, including, and I can't emphasize this enough, the receptionist, who is your first line to anyone who calls or anyone who walks in the door, also, and can be sitting near a client for 20 minutes, an hour, 2 hours as they wait for an appointment, or they're, you know, sitting waiting for something in the reception area, that they understand behaviors and the effects of trauma on a survivor's approach to services. So that really is important. One of the tips and something that we've started doing in trying to understand how a survivor's trauma affects their approach to services is that when we're conducting an intake, one of the questions that we ask is, can you tell me a little bit about your best and your worst experience with a service provider? This gives us a ton of insight and what those triggers, and by triggers, of course, I mean those opportunities for re-traumatization are present for that particular client. I'll also say that that's something that we either ourselves, if we know a client might be interested in working with law enforcement or collaborating with law enforcement or the court process, we might ask those questions there as well so that we can, of course, with consent, pass that information on to our law enforcement partners. And we've just received a wealth of information by simply asking those questions. The other thing that we've learned from feedback from survivors is they often feel as though they're not believed and that we're the only ones who believe them or the only ones on their side. So another thing that we think a lot about, both as a task force and in our internal team, is how do we show or prove that that the survivor has a team of people who is on their side and has their back. And I'll walk through a little of what we came up with moving forward. Again, just a brief overview that organizations that practice trauma-informed services understand that trauma is pervasive, that it's broad, that it's impacted deep, that can often be self-perpetuating. We'll talk a little bit about that later. And that trauma has often occurred in the service context itself. That is so, so important, that often our services themselves can be traumatizing or re-traumatizing. Of course, unintentionally, but that definitely is true, and is, I think, something that we need to understand and admit in order to look at our own policies and procedures in an objective way through a trauma-informed lens. So one of the things that, again, exercise that we did as a department is to come up with kind of our unofficial mission statement. And for us, what that boils down to is that our only goal is to create an atmosphere and experience where survivors feel as though they will feel welcome and they will receive assistance as they define it. For us, that comes down to safety, choice, and engagement. And then this kind of underlying parentheses is how can we behave as differently from a trafficker or a domestic violence perpetrator as possible. And again, that's something that might sound very obvious, but when we look at our policies, when we look at our own procedures, when we look at a system, we see a lot of things that are in place that can really mirror the tactics that a trafficker or an abuser perpetrated against their victim, things that are controlling, that limit choice, that may seem very dangerous, for example, for survivors. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about physical safety. We're going to talk about safety. This is a picture of the International Institute. It's not lit very well, but you will see there are a ton of doors and windows in the front of our building. It's a really it's actually a former mansion. It's a former home, so that really helps us when it comes to this issue of physical and emotional safety for clients. But it also can be really confusing when people are coming to our location for the first time, not knowing which door is the right door. So again, just a practical tip when thinking about physical safety and accessibility of the building. Doing a walkthrough, pretending and remembering maybe what it was like the first time you ever came to this location. Thinking about, is there a safe and clear entrance and exit? One of the changes that we made for our particular department, when I started working here at the Institute, only managers had a key to the back entrance. Now, the Institute is located on a pretty busy street in Buffalo where there's a ton of cars going by. It's very visible, which can be really helpful for new clients, but also can be really dangerous if clients feel exposed, that they're seeing that they're coming here for services. That can be a safety risk. So everyone in our department all advocates advocates and case managers now have a key to the back door so that if they're transporting clients, clients can come into the building through that way. In our future webinar, I think actually the next webinar, we're specifically going to be talking about safety planning, which is something that we do at every meeting. So definitely log back on and join us for that. We came up with a revised policy for home visits. That's something you might want to look at when it comes to physical safety, not only for your staff, certainly, but for survivors. And then the other thing I kind of forgot to say at the beginning of this, that the reason I'm so excited to present on this and why I'm trying to become an ongoing expert in trauma-informed care is because utilizing trauma-informed care has really changed almost everything about the way that we think about services here at the International Institute of Buffalo. It's been the thing that has really changed things for us. And I will say that another thing that has done that has been using a danger assessment. And so we use the Jackie Campbell danger assessment model. It's something to just maybe jot down and look further into, but it's something that has really changed how we safety plan with clients in a really significant way. Another issue around both physical and emotional safety, I think, is that we noticed when we went down to welcome survivors in the lobby, we noticed that people that were waiting for us, and actually this is something that reception noticed, that if a client was coming to us for refugee resettlement or employment, that they were they were often sitting in sofas, yet survivors who are coming to see us in our department, that they were sitting in the chairs. And I think it really was around that emotional or physical safety and not wanting to be triggered by physical boundaries. And so we started replacing, so up in our area, we made sure that we only had chairs. And that was something that we noticed through the self-evaluation process and made changes. Emotional safety is another part of the safety evaluation that we looked at. And again, I could go through all of these things, but I just want to mention a few. One of the things that was very inexpensive and took a little bit of extra time is that we recognized that, especially in the immigrant population, they often they started giving us feedback that every time we called and said, hey, can you come in for a meeting, that they got really nervous that they were in trouble. So we started in making sure that we were specific about what the agenda was for the meeting and what the length was. So this will last about this long, whether we were taking them to court, whether we were taking them to a medical appointment. If you remember in the bullet points of what do we know works, one of those bullet points is that information is empowering. And so having that information beforehand is not only practical, but it can really set up appropriate expectations, which can help with emotional safety. We bought a lot of clocks and made sure that that every advocate and case manager has a clock on their desk that faces the client so that they're aware of the time. In the handouts that are provided, we also developed a well-being safety plan. I hope that most people on the call are aware of a typical safety plan that you would walk through with a survivor, and most of that has to do with physical safety and stalking. Most safety plans are focused on that. We developed a well-being safety plan so that someone can prepare for normal trauma responses. That's another handout that we provide survivors. But perhaps if they know that they'll be triggered, so the night before or the night after, for instance, they testify, or they meet with their immigration attorney to give their statement for their immigration petition, if they know and can predict the trigger, or even if they become triggered and don't know why, that they can pull out a plan that they've created with their case manager or advocate to walk them through and have them recall what the plan is for de-escalating themselves. Another handout that's available for download is what we call a who's who. It took me, I don't know about anyone else on this call, but when I started this work, it took me a really long time to understand the different systems and the different players, the federal law enforcement versus local versus integrated domestic violence court or immigration court or family court. I mean, there's just so many players that we introduce survivors to when they make a choice to engage in our services. So you'll see with that handout that there's a short description. We often ask anyone who is working with them to give them their card and even maybe give us a copy of their ID badge that we can also remind people what their picture is like. It's a visual reminder. Another practice that we've started around emotional well-being is putting together what we call an advocate self-care bag, and this is actually for survivors, but I know that our advocates and case managers use this as well. What we know about a symptom of trauma is that survivors often get anxious when having to talk about what happened to them. They might have addiction issues and their or mental health issues that they need to be grounded about. One of the normal responses to being triggered and talking about a past trauma or even the effect of a trauma is that clients will what's called dissociate, or what it looks like is that they're spacing out or not paying attention. And so having something that they can hold on to, that they can play with, can be really grounding for them and can minimize that dissociation. And so we have these stress balls, we have hard candy, and paper clips are probably the most inexpensive things. We had an intern worm together a ton of rocks and write the word peace or calm in different languages. So this is a bag that that our advocates and case managers have just recently, in the last couple months, started to carry with them. And we were astounded at how popular they were and how often victims asked or survivors asked if they could take these things with them. So again, not costing a lot of money, but it might be something that when you get faith-based groups or block clubs who say, what can I do for you, what can I donate, these might be things to offer, and clients just love them. And it's also a way for us to show a client that we have their back, that they're not alone, that we work with a lot of survivors and we've come prepared because you might need something like that. So we found that it's a great way to build rapport. Okay, so this is our last poll. It's a little bit of a funny question, but the question is, where does everyone know your name? So are there any of these locations where in your own neighborhood, when you walk in, people know who you are, the employees know your order, or they recognize you? So just a couple more seconds. All right, looks like about 40% at the coffee shop, about 25% at your doctor's office, 20% at a bar, restaurant, 20% at the gym, and just a smaller percentage at a dog park. Again, this is a little bit silly, but the purpose of that is for you to be thinking about what that feels like for you. Are you someone who goes back to those establishments because they know your name? And what might that feel like for a survivor who's coming to your offices or getting services from your organization? So again, establishing emotional safety, one thing that we know works is welcome, 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 engagement, engagement, engagement. What would it feel like for you? And again, think about the first time you ever went to a specific location for an appointment. What would it feel like if somebody was waiting outside to greet you? Time may not permit this to be true every time. To meet a survivor who's coming to your offices for the first time, So maybe a shortcut, we make sure that our receptionist knows, this person is coming today, it's their first time here at the Institute. And then the receptionist might take a little bit of extra time with that person in greeting them and offering them coffee and tea, to greet them with their name or say, oh, we're so glad you're here. These are very small things that cost nothing and really increase that engagement. The other thing we make sure what we know is that the same case manager can't always be at every appointment or court date with a survivor, or they might not always be available. So we try to make introductions, not within our whole building, but at least within our small team, so that they understand that we can all be helpful at any time. Kids, do survivors feel like their children are welcome? Do you have toys and games and stuffed animals and puzzles and whatever for the kids to play with? One of the best compliments we ever received is when a survivor was coming in saying that their child was always asking when they could come back and visit us. So the client didn't feel so badly, taking the child out of their normal routine to have to talk about something they weren't excited about in the meeting. We always, always, always ask a client to talk to us about where they're from. Again, this costs hardly anything, but we have a huge map on our wall, and we have these little stickers, and we encourage clients to put a sticker near where they were born. We did that to encourage them to talk. Everybody likes talking about where they're from. It's a great rapport builder. But we also realized that it helped clients feel as though they weren't alone when they saw how many dots were on this map. This is a picture of our staff at one point. We carry this picture with us so that we can point out to a survivor, this is whoever, this is Amy. I can't be at the next appointment, but this is Amy, this is what she looks like, and she'll be there to help walk you through the doctor's appointment. So choice is another thing that we're very focused on. We make sure that clients, as much as possible, can choose the time, day, and location of a meeting. So we can't say, oh, when can you meet? I'll meet you whenever you can meet. But we can say, I have this opening, and this opening, which is best for you. We make sure that ambivalence is, if not encouraged, at least accepted, that clients often change their minds. And when they're in situations like human trafficking or domestic violence, when their choices have been 100% limited, that their ability to experiment with choice is actually a sign of growth. So we embrace ambivalence as much as we can. We try to offer as many types of services as possible. So for instance, we don't have our own shelter, but we have MOUs in place with about 8 different shelters in our area. And we try to talk to survivors about what shelter looks like in each of those locations. So for instance, we have a faith-based shelter that might have daily Christian services. We want a survivor to know about that before choosing which shelter is most appropriate for them, because that might be something that they feel limits their choices and is re-traumatizing, or it might be exactly what they're looking for because their trafficker never allowed them to practice their faith or go to church themselves. Oftentimes, you can't give clients a ton of choices, but even among bad choices, it's helpful to create some type of choice, and just to be thinking about that in that way. This is our coffee station. Again, it seems very small, but we try very hard to make sure that we have 2 different kinds of creamer, several different kinds of tea, even different coffee mugs. We're amazed at how survivors like to choose their own coffee mug. Even that is a way for us to offer choice when they meet with us. Empowerment is another guiding principle of trauma-informed care. And these are, we're getting short on time, so I want to go through some of this quickly, but these are some of the ways that we have encouraged empowerment. One of these is thinking about or acknowledging that a survivor's life is more than human trafficking situation and more than our services, and how can we support and fund outside things that they might be interested in. We also pay survivors to have input into what our materials and what our services look like. Their feedback is not only imperative and makes our work easier and more efficient, but they should be paid for that expertise. And when thinking about satisfaction surveys, and I have to say that this is not something I came up with on my own. It came from a United Way training I went to once. But the trainer was saying that every feedback survey really should only ask 3 questions. And those questions are listed here, that those are really the only things that we need to get feedback on. And we can learn everything we need to know from those. So this, I think, is one of the most important things that I'll talk about today, is really being strengths-based. The core of trauma-informed care is that we stop asking what's wrong with this person and we begin asking what's happened to this person. If we can change this lens, if we can change the paradigm of what's wrong with this person to what's happened to this person, I will say that it will completely change how we provide and offer services. An example of that, and I'll just give you a quick minute to read through, this is kind of a compilation of several victim impact statements. We worked with 3 different survivors in 2 different cases that gave victim impact statements in a federal trial. And we had worked with all of these survivors for quite some time, about 1.5 years each. They were all doing really well. They were all very stable. And when we got their final version of their victim impact statement, it looked something like this. Again, this is a compilation. And what was, I have to admit that my first reaction when I saw this was, what's wrong with them? Like, we didn't do our job. How can they still be thinking this? They're so stable. They're out of the situation. And then we started thinking about what happened to them. And we realized that these traffickers had gotten off many, many times, that they had gotten out of, manipulated their way out of charges, that they had gotten out of long sentences before, so that maybe the survivor was just trying to stay safe. Maybe this was about them going back to the trafficker and saying, you know, they made me testify, but I tried to vote for you. I tried to come to your defense. Or maybe this was just that this was the closest thing to love they had ever experienced, but that was also true. So that lens really changed how we reacted to this. And I can explain this one at a later date. I just want to go through some of these practical tips pretty quickly. And again, this is available to you as a download, and you can ask some questions in the chat portion. Some of the other changes that we made, really being aware of vicarious trauma and addressing that in group supervision, creating an atmosphere where advocates and case managers, where it's okay to say if this client is really annoying me, or I'm afraid, or I don't think I'm doing good work, or I'm exhausted by this client, where they can be really honest about what that looks like, and it's working with the client, its effect on their own work. We make sure that days off are without contact, and that's something that I've really had to train myself on, so that when I have a day off, that I'm not checking my email, that I'm not calling into the office. But that's also really important in the trauma-informed program. We celebrate client successes. We can't really buy gifts for clients, obviously, or boundary issues. But one thing that we started doing is that at the end of a big case, that we invite clients to a luncheon where the district attorney is present, where the victim witness coordinator is present, maybe law enforcement is present. We have a luncheon for all of them together. Again, really quickly, and I know I'm running up against time, we make sure to also talk, these are policy changes at the agency level, that we talk about vicarious trauma in our management meetings. This isn't something that anyone in the other departments often talks about, so it was really up to me to bring up these issues, to make sure that all staff, no matter who they're working with in our agency, are receiving that trauma-informed care training, including interpreters. One thing that we started doing, a change in policy, is that we implemented flex time. So clients often were having trouble meeting with us during the typical 9 to 5 hours. So not all the time, but once in a while allowing for that weekend or early or late meeting and being able to put that on the timesheet and have that be okay. Collaboration, some of the changes that we made, really having a safety evaluation for new staff, but also for our own building. That's something that we're actually working on now. We started having on-site yoga once a week after work, so at 4:30 once a week. Staff and clients are invited to a yoga class that we hold here at the Institute. We have a family photo day once a year, knowing that a lot of survivors, they've had to escape situations, so they don't have a lot of family photos, or those photos were destroyed by their trafficker or their abuser. So these are things that we've found that can be celebrations, that can be something that we're collaborating among different programs within our organization. And of course, being aware of all of the different programs within our organization so that we can make referrals. I think that perhaps during the chat session, we can talk about some of the strategies about how we collaborate with other organizations, especially those that might not espouse trauma-informed care. That's a picture of our staff and our front lawn around one of the celebrations that we had. And I just want to end by asking everyone to participate in an evaluation. Again, this is a new 4-part series that we're working on with OVC and OVCTTAC. We really value your feedback so that we can make the next question and answer, those chat sessions, but also the remaining 3 presentations that we can meet your needs as we roll those out.
Absolutely.
4 o'clock.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. That was right on the nose, very impressive. I just want to follow up and say, yes, do please follow the link. We'll also send that out to all of you. And just to note, though, that evaluation link, that goes straight to OVCTTAC, and it'll be a few months before we are able to get that feedback. So if there is something that you have a question about or a recommendation or that you'd like us to implement during this series, if you have questions or requests for one of the future presentations, please send that to us directly at the email at the bottom of the screen right now, tictraining@freedomnetworkusa.org. We'll get that directly, and we can integrate that into the series immediately to make sure that this is as helpful to you as humanly possible. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, we'll follow up with more information with the materials that were attached, the handouts from this session. We'll send you the recording of this session in case you want to review it again before the chat session. But please do send us your questions in advance. Thanks to the participants who already entered their questions during this session. We'll hold on to those and everything else that comes in and strategize with Amy to make sure we're able to answer all of your questions 2 weeks from now. So we'll see you then. Until then, have a great week.